I should have known something was wrong when Alison spent 45 minutes picking out earrings for a company dinner. My wife had never been indecisive about jewelry before. She wore her grandmother's pearls to everything that mattered and costume stuff to everything that didn't. But tonight, she was holding up different pairs to the mirror like she was preparing for a job interview instead of another corporate schmooze fest. "You sure you want me there?" I asked from the bedroom doorway, adjusting my tie. "I could always claim food poisoning." "Don't be ridiculous, Trevor." She didn't look away from the mirror. "It's important that you meet the team." Important, right. In 15 years of marriage, Alison had never once described my presence at her work events as important. Usually, she introduced me with the enthusiasm of someone showing off a moderately interesting houseplant. The restaurant was one of those places where they charge $30 for 3 scallops and call it artisanal. The kind of spot where everyone speaks in hushed tones and the waiters hover like vultures in bow ties. Alison's team had already claimed a corner table when we arrived, and I recognized the usual suspects. Renee from marketing, who laughed too loud at everything, Jim from accounts, who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a few faces I'd seen at previous company functions but couldn't name. Then there was Graham Cole. I knew Graham by reputation before I knew him by sight. Regional vice president, 15 years with the company, the kind of guy who wore expensive suits and had opinions about wine. He stood when we approached, extending a manicured hand and flashing the sort of smile that probably closed million-dollar deals. "You must be Trevor," he said. "Alison's told me so much about you." That was interesting, because Alison had barely mentioned Graham to me. But I shook his hand and played along, settling into the chair beside my wife, while the conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to: quarterly projections, client meetings, office politics. 20 minutes in, Renee had already finished 2 glasses of wine and was getting chatty. "So, Trevor," she said, leaning across the table with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share state secrets, "what do you think of Alison's new schedule? All these late nights at the office?" I glanced at my wife, who was suddenly very interested in her salmon. "She's dedicated to her work. Always has been." "Oh, super dedicated," Renee continued, apparently oblivious to the warning look Alison was shooting her. "Especially with all those weekend strategy sessions. Right, Graham?" Graham's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. "We've had some challenging projects lately. Alison's been invaluable." The word choice struck me as odd. Not helpful, not essential, invaluable. Like she was a prized asset he couldn't bear to lose. That's when it happened. Jim had been asking about my work, compliance consulting, about as exciting as it sounds, when another couple approached the table. Friends of Graham's, apparently, because he stood to greet them with genuine warmth. "Trevor, I'd like you to meet the Hendersons," Alison said, her voice taking on that bright, artificial tone she used at cocktail parties. She gestured toward me with one perfectly manicured hand. "This is Trevor. He's just someone I live with. Basically my past." The table went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Renee let out a nervous laugh, and Jim suddenly became fascinated by his wine glass. The Hendersons looked confused, clearly unsure whether this was some sort of inside joke they weren't getting. But Graham was smiling. Not the polished corporate smile he'd been wearing all evening, but something sharper, more satisfied. "Great," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "Then we can talk alone." That's when I saw it, the flash of panic that crossed my wife's face. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the way her skin went pale, or the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke. "You know him?" The question was directed at Graham, but she was looking at me. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about late nights at the office or weekend strategy sessions. This was about the fact that Graham Cole and I had history. 3 years ago, I'd led a compliance audit at a subsidiary company where Graham had been a division head. It had been a routine review that turned ugly when we'd uncovered some creative accounting in his department. Nothing criminal, but enough to cost him a promotion and earn me a reputation as someone who didn't overlook inconvenient details for the sake of office politics. Graham remembered me all right, and judging by the way he was looking at Alison, like she was a prize he'd already won, I was starting to understand why my wife had been working so many late nights lately. "We've met," Graham said simply. "Small world." I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to process what I'd just learned. In the mirror above the sink, I looked exactly like what Alison had called me, someone from her past. 43 years old, graying at the temples, wearing a suit I'd bought 3 years ago. Nothing wrong with the picture, but nothing particularly exciting either. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on to safer topics. But I noticed things I'd missed before. The way Alison's hand rested on the table, close enough to Graham's that their fingers could brush if either of them moved an inch. The way she laughed at his jokes, not the polite chuckle she gave to client humor, but genuine delight. The way she kept glancing at him when she thought no one was looking. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of small talk and corporate gossip. I played my part, asking appropriate questions and nodding at appropriate moments. But inside, I was already 3 steps ahead, thinking like the compliance officer I'd trained to be, gathering information, identifying irregularities, planning my next move. Because if there was one thing I'd learned in 15 years of marriage and 20 years in corporate consulting, it was this. When people think they're smarter than you, they get careless. And careless people leave evidence. We said our goodbyes in the restaurant parking lot. Graham shook my hand again, holding it just a moment longer than necessary. "Good seeing you again, Trevor," he said. "I'm sure we'll be talking soon." I smiled back, matching his tone exactly. "I'm sure we will." On the drive home, Alison was quiet. She stared out the passenger window, watching the city lights blur past, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. Finally, as we pulled into our driveway, she spoke. "Graham mentioned you two had worked together before." Briefly. I turned off the engine but didn't move to get out of the car. "Why didn't you tell me he was your boss?" "It never came up." She was already reaching for the door handle. Besides, it was years ago. Ancient history. Ancient history, just like me, apparently. I followed her into the house, watching as she kicked off her heels and headed straight for the stairs. No debriefing about the dinner, no discussion of the evening's events. Just a quick, "I'm tired," and the sound of her footsteps on the hardwood. I poured myself a scotch and sat in my home office, staring at the computer screen without really seeing it. Outside, our neighbor Mrs. Grafton was walking her ancient beagle, the same route she'd taken every night for the past 5 years. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but something fundamental had shifted. My wife was having an affair with her boss. A man who remembered me as the compliance officer who derailed his career. A man who was now in a position to give Alison everything she'd ever wanted. Promotions, bonuses, status, excitement. Everything I apparently couldn't provide. I finished my scotch and headed upstairs, where Alison was already in bed, facing away from me. Her breathing was too controlled, too measured. She wasn't asleep. "Good dinner?" I said quietly. She didn't turn around. I lay there in the dark, listening to the house settle around us, and began planning my next move. Because if Alison thought she could rewrite our history and call me her past, she was about to learn that some chapters weren't finished yet. The next morning, Alison left early for a client breakfast. She kissed my cheek on her way out, a gesture so automatic and empty it felt like being marked by a rubber stamp. I watched from the kitchen window as she backed out of the driveway, noting that she'd taken extra time with her appearance. New perfume, too. Something expensive that didn't smell like guilt, but probably should have. I'd taken the day off, ostensibly to catch up on paperwork for my own clients. But really, I wanted time to think, to plan, to figure out exactly what I was dealing with. The first step was information gathering. I'm good at that. It's what I do for a living. Companies hire me to find the discrepancies they can't see, the problems hiding in plain sight. The skills transfer surprisingly well to personal situations. I started with Alison's home office. She kept her personal laptop there, along with files from work she occasionally brought home. I wasn't looking for smoking guns. I'm not the type to go through someone's email or phone. But I was curious about her schedule, her recent projects, anything that might explain the sudden increase in late nights and weekend strategy sessions. Her desk calendar was revealing enough. Over the past 3 months, she'd blocked out an unusual number of evening meetings. Project review with GC, strategy session, GC, client dinner, GC, Graham Cole. I photographed the calendar with my phone, then put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Old habits from compliance work. Document everything, disturb nothing, leave no trace of your investigation. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Samir. Coffee later? Need to hear about last night's corporate torture session. Samir worked in IT for a mid-sized consulting firm, and we'd been friends since college. He had the rare combination of technical skills and complete discretion that made him invaluable when you needed someone to help you understand the digital side of a problem. We met at our usual spot, a coffee shop downtown that catered to freelancers and remote workers. Samir took one look at my face and ordered 2 large coffees instead of his usual tea. "That bad?" he asked. I gave him the highlights of the dinner, watching his expression shift from amusement to concern as I described Graham's reaction to seeing me. "So, let me get this straight," he said when I finished. "Your wife is working late with a guy you audited 3 years ago. A guy who definitely remembers you, and not fondly. And last night she basically introduced you as her roommate. That's the situation. And you think I think she's having an affair, yes." Samir stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "What do you want to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? The smart thing would be to confront Alison directly, ask for an explanation, maybe suggest marriage counseling. The mature thing would be to have an honest conversation about where our relationship was heading. But I kept thinking about the way Graham had smiled when Alison called me her past. The satisfaction in his voice when he'd said we could talk alone, the casual cruelty of it. "I want to know what I'm dealing with first," I said. "Get the full picture." Samir nodded slowly. "You need help with that?" "Maybe. Can you do me a favor? Look up Graham Cole, Regional VP at Meridian Financial Services. I want to know everything that's public record, employment history, social media, news articles, anything." "Consider it done." He pulled out his laptop. "What else?" "I need to understand their relationship. How serious it is, how long it's been going on, whether this is just an affair or something more." "You thinking about divorce?" The question hit me harder than I'd expected. 15 years of marriage, and I was sitting in a coffee shop discussing the end of it with my best friend like we were planning a weekend trip. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I want to be prepared for whatever comes next." That evening, Alison came home at her usual time, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant. A peace offering, maybe, or just guilt management. We ate dinner while she told me about her day, a story that included 3 meetings, 2 conference calls, and a lunch with a potential client. No mention of Graham, no reference to the previous night's dinner. She was a good liar. I'd give her that. After dinner, she went upstairs to take a bath. I heard the water running, heard her moving around in the bedroom. 20 minutes later, she came down wearing yoga pants and an old sweater, hair pulled back, looking like the woman I'd married instead of the polished professional she'd become. "Want to watch something?" she asked, settling onto the couch beside me. We found a movie neither of us had seen, some romantic comedy that required no emotional investment. Alison curled up against my side, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that the dinner had been a misunderstanding, that the calendar entries had innocent explanations, that my wife wasn't planning to trade me in for a newer model. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and I saw it. That micro-expression of excitement quickly suppressed, the slight intake of breath, the way her fingers hesitated before she turned the phone face down without responding. "Work?" I asked. "Spam," she said, not meeting my eyes. I nodded and turned back to the movie, but I was done pretending. Whatever was happening between Alison and Graham, it was real. It was ongoing, and it was about to become my problem. The next day, I put my plan into action. First, I called Graham's office. Not to speak to him, I had nothing to say to him yet, but I wanted to understand his schedule, his availability, his patterns. I posed as a vendor trying to set up a meeting, and his assistant was happy to explain that Mr. Cole was typically in the office from 8 to 6, with lunch meetings most days and frequent evening events. Evening events. Interesting. Next, I drove by Meridian Financial Services office building. It was downtown, a glass and steel tower with underground parking and multiple entrances. The kind of place where people could come and go without being noticed, where working late could mean anything. I didn't have a plan yet, not exactly. But I was gathering intelligence, understanding the battlefield. If this was going to be a war, I intended to win it. That afternoon, Samir called with his research results. "Your boy Graham is interesting," he said. "Divorced 2 years ago, no kids. Lives in a penthouse condo downtown, drives a BMW, belongs to the country club. Standard issue corporate climber." Anything unusual? Well, his ex-wife's divorce filing mentioned irreconcilable differences, but the settlement was sealed. Could mean anything, but sealed settlements usually mean someone wanted to keep something quiet. What else? He's got a reputation as a player. Nothing actionable, but if you read between the lines of his social media and some industry gossip, he's been linked to several women since his divorce. All of them younger. All of them connected to his work somehow. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Connected how? Clients, vendors, subordinates. He's got a type, apparently. Ambitious professional women who could benefit from his influence. Subordinates, like regional sales directors, for example. "There's something else," Samir continued. "I found a photo from a company event last month. Industry networking thing. Want to guess who was there?" I didn't need to guess. "Send me the photo." It arrived 30 seconds later. Graham and Alison at what looked like a cocktail reception, standing close together, her hand on his arm. They were both smiling, but it wasn't the polite smile of colleagues. It was intimate, familiar. The photo was dated 3 weeks ago. The same weekend Alison had told me she was visiting her sister in Philadelphia. I stared at the image for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, not yet, but a cold, calculating fury that I recognized from my most difficult audits. The feeling I got when I discovered that someone had been lying to me, stealing from their company, thinking they were too smart to get caught. That evening, Alison worked late again. "Big presentation tomorrow," she explained via text. "Don't wait up." I didn't wait up. Instead, I drove downtown and parked across from Graham's building. His BMW was in the visitor parking area, and at 9:30, I watched my wife walk out of the lobby, checking her phone as she headed toward her car. She looked happy, relaxed, satisfied. I followed her home from a distance, staying several cars back, and watched her practice her story during the drive. I could see her in the rearview mirror, moving her lips slightly, rehearsing whatever explanation she'd give me for being 3 hours late. When she got home, she was full of apologies and details about the presentation, the client concerns, the last-minute changes that had kept everyone at the office until nearly 10. She was still talking when we went to bed, spinning an elaborate story that might have been convincing if I hadn't seen her leaving Graham's building with my own eyes. That's when I knew for certain my marriage was over. The only question now was how it would end, and who would control the narrative. I lay awake that night listening to Alison's breathing even out as she fell asleep, and began planning my next move. Because if she thought she could rewrite our history and call me her past, she was about to learn that some chapters end exactly the way they're supposed to. 3 days later, I had enough evidence to bury them both. Not legally. I wasn't interested in criminal charges or civil suits, but professionally, ethically, and personally, I had everything I needed to destroy their carefully constructed little romance and the careers they'd built around it. Samir had been invaluable. His IT background meant he understood digital footprints in ways that most people didn't, and he'd helped me piece together a timeline that was damning in its clarity. Credit card records showed Graham and Alison at the same restaurants on nights when she'd told me she was working late. Hotel loyalty program data revealed weekend trips that coincided with her supposed visits to family. Even their LinkedIn profiles told a story, if you knew how to read them, professional endorsements and recommendations that were just a little too effusive, a little too personal. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Grafton. Our 70-year-old neighbor had always been friendly in the way that retired people often are, interested in everyone's business, eager to chat over the fence, full of observations about the comings and goings on our street. I'd never paid much attention to her commentary, but after my conversation with Samir, I started listening more carefully. "Your wife's been keeping busy lately," she mentioned one morning as I was getting my mail. "Saw her leaving pretty early yesterday, and the day before that. Very dedicated to her work, that one." "She is," I agreed. "Always has been." Mrs. Grafton adjusted her glasses, the way she did when she was about to share something particularly interesting. "Funny thing, though. I was walking Buster late Tuesday night. You know how he gets when his stomach's upset. And I could have sworn I saw her car coming home around 11:30. But then, Wednesday morning, she mentioned to me that she'd been out of town for work. Must have been mistaken. Tuesday night. The night Alison had told me she was staying overnight in Hartford for client meetings. The night I'd found her side of the bed empty when I'd gotten up for water at midnight. Easy to lose track of time when you're busy, I said carefully. "Oh, absolutely." Mrs. Grafton's smile was knowing. "Though I do have a good memory for cars, especially that little red Honda of hers. Very distinctive." That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Graham's office and scheduled a meeting. His assistant was surprised. Apparently, vendors didn't usually request face-to-face meetings with regional VPs, but I explained that I had some concerns about compliance issues that required his immediate attention, and suddenly his calendar opened up. Nothing gets a corporate executive's attention faster than the word compliance. The meeting was set for Thursday at 2 o'clock. I spent Wednesday evening preparing, the way I would for any high-stakes audit. I gathered my evidence, organized my talking points, and planned my approach. This wasn't going to be an emotional confrontation. It was going to be a professional presentation, clean, factual, and devastating. Alison was working late again, of course. "Client crisis," she'd explained over dinner. "Might be there until 10 or 11. I checked. Graham's building directory showed his office lights were on at 9:30 p.m. Thursday morning, I dressed carefully. My best suit, the one I wore to important client meetings, conservative tie, polished shoes, briefcase with all my documentation. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a compliance officer with serious concerns about ethical violations. Meridian Financial Services occupied floors 15 through 22 of a downtown tower. Graham's office was on 21, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the harbor. His assistant, a woman in her 50s with the efficient manner of someone who'd been managing executives for decades, showed me in, promptly, at 2. Graham was on a phone call when I arrived, but he wrapped it up quickly and stood to shake my hand. He was wearing his corporate armor, expensive suit, confident smile, the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms and closed deals. "Trevor," he said, gesturing toward the chairs in front of his desk. "Good to see you again. Margaret said you had some compliance concerns you wanted to discuss?" "I do." I settled into the chair and opened my briefcase. "Thanks for making time. I know how busy you are." "Of course. Always happy to help a fellow professional." His smile was perfectly calibrated. Friendly, but not overly familiar. Professional, but not cold. "What can I do for you?" I pulled out a folder and placed it on his desk. "I've become aware of some potential ethical violations within your organization, specifically conflicts of interest involving supervisory relationships and the approval of compensation and advancement decisions." Graham's smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. "I see. And what makes you think there are violations?" "Evidence." I opened the folder and slid the first document across his desk. "This is a record of bonus approvals for your direct reports over the past 18 months. One employee in particular has received significantly higher compensation increases than her peers, despite comparable performance metrics." He glanced at the document without picking it up. "Performance metrics don't tell the whole story. Some employees bring additional value that's harder to quantify." "I'm sure they do." I placed a second document on the desk. "This is a timeline of business travel and expense reports for the same employee. Interesting patterns emerge when you cross-reference the dates with your own travel schedule." Now he picked up the papers, scanning them with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. When he finished, he set them down and leaned back in his chair. "You've been busy," he said. "It's what I do." "And what exactly do you want, Trevor?" The question hung in the air between us. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the point where I could have demanded his resignation, threatened to expose the affair, or negotiated some kind of settlement. But I'd already decided on a different approach. "I want you to understand that I know," I said simply. "I know about the relationship, I know about the favorable treatment, and I know about the lies. All of it." Graham studied me for a long moment. "And I want you to know that this ends now. The relationship, the special treatment, the late-night strategy sessions, all of it." "Or what?" I smiled, the same calm, professional smile I used when delivering audit results to clients who'd been cooking their books. "Or I file a formal complaint with your company's ethics board, along with documentation that will end both of your careers. Not just here, anywhere in this industry. You know how these things work, Graham. Once you're labeled as someone who can't maintain professional boundaries, who shows favoritism to subordinates you're sleeping with, you become unemployable." He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the harbor. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, less polished, more real. "She's not happy with you, you know." "I know. She hasn't been for a while." "I know that too. So why fight it? Why not just let her go?" It was a fair question, and I'd asked myself the same thing over the past few days. Why not just accept that my marriage was over and move on? Why go through the trouble of gathering evidence and making threats? The answer was simple. Because they'd made it about more than just a failed marriage. They'd made it about lies, manipulation, and abuse of power. They'd made it about thinking they were smarter than everyone around them, that they could get away with anything as long as they were careful enough. "Because you're not just taking my wife," I said. "You're using your position to do it. You're giving her bonuses and promotions and opportunities that other employees don't get, not because she's earned them, but because she's sleeping with you. That's not a relationship. It's corruption." Graham's smile was bitter. "You think you're the hero in this story?" "No," I said, standing up and closing my briefcase. "I think I'm the compliance officer, and you're the violation." I left him sitting there with my evidence spread across his desk and walked out of his office without looking back. In the elevator, I checked my phone and found 3 missed calls from Alison. By the time I reached the parking garage, she was calling again. "We need to talk," she said when I answered. "Yes," I agreed. "We do." That evening, we sat in our living room like strangers negotiating a business deal. Alison had come home early, her face pale and her usual confidence nowhere to be seen. She'd obviously talked to Graham after my visit, and she'd obviously realized that the game was over. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About the affair? A week? About the lies and the favoritism? 3 days?" She nodded slowly. "What do you want?" "I want you to resign from Meridian. Today. I want you to end the relationship with Graham. And I want you to move out of this house." "And if I don't?" I showed her copies of the same documents I'd given Graham. "Then I destroy both of your careers and file for divorce with evidence of adultery and professional misconduct. Your choice." Alison stared at the papers for a long time. When she finally looked up, there was something like respect in her eyes. "I underestimated you," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "You did." She moved out the next day. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my favorite bar when Samir found me. "You look terrible," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Thanks. You really know how to cheer a guy up." He signaled the bartender for 2 beers and studied my face. "How are you holding up?" It was a complicated question. Alison had resigned from Meridian as promised, citing personal reasons and new opportunities. She'd moved into a furnished apartment downtown and started job hunting in other cities. Graham had requested a transfer to the company's West Coast office, effective immediately. To outside observers, it probably looked like a series of unrelated career moves. But I knew the truth, and so did they. I'd won. So why did I feel so empty? "I keep thinking about what Graham said," I told Samir, "about whether I'm the hero in this story. Are you having second thoughts?" "Not about what I did. They were stealing from the company, lying to everyone around them, thinking they were untouchable. They deserved what they got. But," I took a long drink of my beer, "but I destroyed my marriage to prove a point about professional ethics. That's not exactly a fairy tale ending." Samir was quiet for a moment. "You want to know what I think?" "Sure." "I think you didn't destroy your marriage. I think your marriage was already destroyed and you just refused to pretend otherwise." He leaned forward. "How long had it been since Alison looked at you the way she looked at Graham? How long since she talked about you like you were part of her future instead of her past?" The answer was years, if I was honest. Our relationship had been slowly eroding for a long time, worn down by routine and complacency, and the gradual erosion of whatever had brought us together in the first place. The affair hadn't caused our problems. It had just made them impossible to ignore. "You could have handled it differently," Samir continued. "You could have confronted her privately, suggested counseling, tried to work things out. But would that have changed anything? Would she have chosen you over Graham if you'd asked her to?" I thought about the way Alison had looked at Graham during that company dinner, the excitement in her voice when she talked about her work, the careful way she'd planned her lies and covered her tracks. "No," I said. "She was already gone." "Then you did the right thing. You made sure that when it ended on your terms." That night, I went home to a house that felt too big and too quiet. I poured myself a scotch and sat in my office, looking through the papers scattered across my desk. Evidence of a marriage that had failed, a career that continued, a life that needed rebuilding. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You win. I hope you're satisfied." It was from Alison, obviously. She'd gotten a new phone, probably a new phone plan, maybe even a new identity for all I knew. Starting over in whatever city would have her, with whatever company was willing to hire a regional sales director with a gap in her employment history. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide how to respond. Did I win? Was I satisfied? The answer was complicated. I'd achieved my objectives, ended the affair, exposed the corruption, protected my own interests in the divorce. I'd proven that I wasn't the harmless, overlooked husband they'd thought I was. I'd shown them that actions have consequences, that lies eventually surface, that no one is as smart as they think they are. But winning felt different than I'd expected. Colder, more final. I typed back, "I'm satisfied that justice was served." Her response came immediately. "Justice? You destroyed 2 careers over a relationship that wasn't working anyway." I exposed corruption. "You destroyed your own career when you decided to sleep with your boss. And Graham? He never did anything to you personally." That was where she was wrong. Graham had done something to me personally. He'd treated me like an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a past to be discarded. He'd smiled when my wife called me irrelevant, and he'd thought he was clever enough to steal her without consequences. "Graham used his position to give you advantages other employees didn't get," I typed. "That's not romance. It's corruption. And corruption always has a price." She didn't respond after that. A month later, I ran into Renee at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me, the way people do when they don't know whether you're the victim or the villain in a story they've only heard pieces of. "Trevor," she said, glancing around like she was hoping someone would rescue her from the conversation. "How are you?" "I'm fine. How are things at Meridian?" "Different," she said carefully. "We have a new regional director. Nice guy, very professional." "Good to hear." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Did you really file a complaint against Graham and Alison?" Word had gotten out, apparently. Not the details. Those were confidential. But office gossip has a way of filling in the blanks, and the story had probably grown in the telling. "I reported ethical violations to the appropriate authorities," I said. "What happened after that was up to the company." Renee nodded slowly. "A lot of people are saying you were vindictive, that you went too far. A lot of people weren't married to one of the parties involved. But still, their careers were built on lies," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. "Graham was giving Alison bonuses and promotions because they were sleeping together, not because she'd earned them. How is that fair to everyone else who actually did earn their advancement?" Renee looked uncomfortable, but she didn't argue, because she knew I was right, even if she didn't want to admit it. "I heard Alison moved to Denver," she said. "Good for her. And Graham took early retirement." That was news to me, but not surprising. A forced transfer to the West Coast, followed by early retirement, was probably the company's way of making the problem disappear without admitting there had been a problem in the first place. "I hope they're both happy," I said, and I meant it. Because the truth was, I didn't hate them anymore. I'd been angry, yes, and hurt, and determined to make them pay for what they'd done. But now that it was over, I mostly felt tired. Tired of thinking about them, tired of reliving the betrayal, tired of being defined by what they'd done to me, rather than what I was going to do next. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I sold the house. It was too big for one person, too full of memories I didn't want to keep. I bought a smaller place across town, with a view of the water and enough space for a home office. I kept working, kept taking on new clients, kept doing what I'd always done, finding problems and fixing them. But I also started dating again, carefully and without expectations. I joined a hiking club, took a cooking class, learned to play chess. I built a new life that had nothing to do with Alison or Graham, or the marriage that had defined my 40s. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I thought about what Samir had said, that I'd made sure the ending happened on my terms. He was right. I'd controlled the narrative, protected my interests, and ensured that the people who'd betrayed me paid a price for their actions. I'd proven that I wasn't the harmless, overlooked husband they'd thought I was. But more than that, I'd proven something to myself, that I had the strength to walk away from a life that wasn't working, even when walking away meant burning it down first. The last I heard, Alison was working for a smaller company in Denver, making about half what she'd made at Meridian. Graham had indeed taken early retirement and was living in Florida, far from the corporate world where his reputation had been destroyed. They'd both started over, just like I had. The difference was that they'd started over because I'd forced them to, while I'd chosen my new beginning myself. And that, I realized, was the real victory. Not the evidence I'd gathered or the careers I'd ended or the divorce settlement I'd negotiated. The real victory was that I'd refused to be a victim of their choices. I'd taken control of my own story and written an ending that I could live with. They'd called me their past, and they'd been right about that much. But they'd forgotten that the past has a way of catching up with people who think they're too smart to face consequences. I was their past, all right. And I was the past that finally came due.